The house on Eldon Street had a certain stillness about it, the kind that felt deliberate. It was the last one on the block, set slightly farther back than the others, with ivy creeping over its front porch and lace curtains always drawn tight. No one ever saw who lived there during the day. But every Saturday evening, the porch light would flicker on, and women began arriving. Always alone. Always silent. Some came on foot, others by car, but they never came together. They entered, with calm faces and downcast eyes, clutching books to their chests. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a quiet Bible study group, harmless, even wholesome. Kim didn't notice the house at first. She had only recently moved into the neighborhood with her mother, Amelia, after a long stretch of hospital visits and a divorce that still hung heavy in the corners of their new home. She was 17, too young to be considered grown, too old to be treated like a child, and completely uninterested in making new friends. School was difficult. The students weren't cruel, but they were cliquish, and Kim's silence made her easy to ignore. She spent her lunches alone, scribbling in notebooks, sketching shadows and eyes and unfamiliar symbols she couldn't name. Her teachers called her bright but withdrawn. Her mother called her deep. Kim just felt misplaced. It was one of the quiet girls from her homeroom who handed her the invitation. A small card, cream-colored and handwritten, folded carefully in half. The ink was a deep violet, and the writing precise. Saturday gathering, for those seeking peace, stillness, and scripture. There was no address, just Sister Miriam's house, end of Eldon. It didn't feel pushy. There was no pressure, just an offering, a quiet one. Kim didn't tell her mother she was going. She didn't know why. Maybe because it felt sacred, or maybe because she didn't want it questioned. She walked slowly through the neighborhood that Saturday evening, her sweater pulled tightly around her and the card tucked into her pocket. The streets were unusually empty, as if the world around her had been dimmed. When she reached the house, the porch light was already glowing. She hesitated, hand on the gate, watching as another woman entered ahead of her. She looked older, maybe in her 30s, but she didn't glance back. She simply opened the door and vanished inside. When Kim entered, the warmth of the house startled her. It wasn't just the temperature, but the atmosphere. Candles flickered on every available surface. Mantels, windowsills, small glass bowls along the stairs. The scent of dried lavender and something darker, like myrrh or old paper, hung thick in the air. The living room was spacious and strangely bare. The furniture had been pushed to the walls, leaving only a circle of mismatched wooden chairs in the center. A single table sat at the edge of the room, holding a large Bible, a silver cross, and a bowl of water with flower petals floating inside. There were 9 women already seated, each one dressed in muted earth tones, their hair pinned back or covered in scarves. They all looked different in age and background, but they shared a strange serenity. They acknowledged Kim's entrance with soft nods, but no words. Their eyes lingered on her just long enough to make her aware of it, but not long enough to unsettle her. The one who stood to greet her was the oldest. Her face was sharp but kind, her hair hidden beneath a white veil, and her clothing was the closest thing Kim had ever seen to a nun's habit outside of movies. She smiled without showing teeth and motioned to an empty chair. The gathering began. Without fanfare. There were no introductions, no announcements. The women opened their Bibles to the same page without being told. They began to read aloud in turn, their voices weaving together in a strange rhythm that felt more practiced than spontaneous. Kim listened, though she couldn't focus on the words. Her attention drifted to the candlelight, the way the shadows moved across their faces, the soft rustle of pages turning. When it was her turn to read, no one pressured her. She simply passed, and the woman beside her continued without hesitation. After the readings, the women closed their books and bowed. Their heads, one by one, they shared small prayers. Not out loud, but whispered, as though sending them through the floor itself. Sister Miriam rose only once, to refill the bowl of water with petals from a tin tucked beneath the table. She moved without sound. Her presence was commanding without being forceful. When she spoke, her voice was low and musical, full of reverence. She spoke not of sin or damnation, but of stillness, of letting go of the noise of the world, of entering into something deeper than thought. Kim didn't understand all of it. But she didn't need to. She felt pulled toward it, not by fear, but by a strange calm that wrapped itself around her like a fog. When the gathering ended, there was no dismissal. The women simply rose and exited in silence, as if moving through water. One of them brushed Kim's shoulder gently as she passed, and the touch lingered longer than it should have. She was the last to leave, her fingers trailing the edge of the doorway as she stepped into the night. The walk home was quiet. The street lamps flickered, and her breath rose in soft clouds. Her mother was asleep when she returned. Kim didn't speak. She didn't write. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the rhythm of the whispered prayers still looping in her ears. And when her eyes finally closed, she dreamed of a circle of women standing in a room of candlelight, chanting words she didn't know, but somehow understood. The Saturdays began to blend together. What started as a quiet curiosity quickly became a ritual of its own. Each week, Kim returned to the house on Eldon Street just as dusk fell. She didn't knock anymore. The door was always unlocked and the women were always waiting. The same circle, the same books, the same whispered prayers. But something shifted after her third visit. The silence felt heavier now, more purposeful. The pauses between scriptures stretched longer. The candles burned lower, their flames trembling as if reacting to something invisible. And Sister Miriam, though still gentle, began to look at Kim differently. Longer glances, slight nods, as if seeing something unfold that no one else could. Kim began to feel different, too. Her sleep was restless. She would wake in the middle of the night with strange images flashing behind her eyes. Shadows moving in circles, symbols carved into stone, voices that sounded like they came from underground. She couldn't remember the dreams in full, only the feeling they left behind, a mix of reverence and dread. At school, she became quieter. Her notebooks filled with spiral patterns, half-written verses, and sketches of doorways. The other girls at the prayer group smiled at her more now, but there was something unreadable in their eyes. Not kindness exactly, not approval, more like recognition. On the fourth week, after the scripture reading ended, Sister Miriam did not dismiss the group. Instead, she stood slowly and spoke in her usual soft tone, her words calm but deliberate. She said that some paths are not found. They are offered, that there are layers to faith, just like there are layers to the world. She didn't look at Kim directly, but the message felt personal. The other women remained still. No one reached for their coats or turned to leave. The room felt suspended, like a held breath. Miriam stepped toward a cabinet at the back of the room and opened it with a key she produced from the folds of her robe. Behind the door was not storage or supplies, but a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that came from below was colder, denser, like it had been waiting for years to escape. She invited anyone who was ready to go deeper to follow. No one moved at first. Then, one by one, the women began to rise and step toward the stairs. Kim hesitated only a moment before joining them. The steps were wooden and creaked underfoot. The descent felt longer than it should have been. The air grew heavier the further down they went, and the smell changed. Less like lavender, more like something old and earthy, like stone and wax and time. The basement was larger than she expected. It wasn't unfinished like most suburban basements, but transformed into something between a chapel and a storeroom. The walls were lined with low bookshelves, each filled not with modern Bibles, but with ancient-looking tomes and cracked leather bindings. Candles glowed along the floor, casting golden halos on the concrete walls. The floor had been scrubbed clean, but still bore faint circular markings, etched into the surface like permanent echoes of something old. At the center of the room stood a wide wooden table, and above it, hanging from the ceiling, was a ring of bells, each no larger than a thumb. Their presence was subtle but strange. Kim watched as the women formed a quiet ring around the table, standing in practiced positions. Sister Miriam lit a single white candle at the head of the table and recited a passage Kim didn't recognize. The language was lyrical, rhythmic, but not English, not Latin either. It sounded like scripture that had been forgotten by time. Kim stood just outside the circle, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't know what to do, but no one asked her to leave. No one explained. The ceremony wasn't for her. It was for the room, for the silence, for something beneath it, all. The women chanted softly, their eyes closed, their voices rising and falling in waves. The bells overhead did not move, but Kim thought she could hear them ringing, faintly, like a sound traveling from deep underground. As the ritual ended, the women began to hum a slow, breathy tone that resonated in the chest more than the ears. One of them placed a small cloth bundle onto the table. Sister Miriam unwrapped it carefully to reveal a single black stone and a thin strip of parchment. She dipped the stone in oil and pressed it against her own forehead, then passed it to the next woman. Each did the same. When it came to Kim, she looked at it for a moment before copying their movements. The oil was cold and the scent was unfamiliar, bitter and metallic. When the last woman finished, Miriam folded the parchment and returned both items to the cloth. The candle was snuffed. The bells remained still. No one spoke as they ascended the stairs. The house above felt warmer now, almost too warm. The sudden return to carpet and lamplight and the ticking clock was jarring. The other women returned to their seats briefly, sipped water, smiled softly. No one mentioned what had happened below. Sister Miriam simply said that those who walked deeper sometimes left traces behind, that the deeper the truth, the more silent it became. Kim walked home that night slower than usual. Her thoughts were scattered, her limbs heavy. The lights from street lamps looked hazy, like the air itself was thicker. When she reached her house, she paused at the door and looked back at the empty street. There was no one there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. Not a person, just a presence, one that now knew her name. Amelia had always trusted her instincts, especially when it came to her daughter. In the years following the divorce, she'd become finely attuned to Kim's rhythms, the little shifts in her tone, the way her shoulders rose ever so slightly when something was wrong, the way she withdrew from the world when something unsettled her. So, when Kim began coming home from her Saturday gatherings quieter than usual, Amelia noticed immediately. Not the usual teenage silence. This was different. Her daughter moved more deliberately, as if mimicking peace rather than feeling it. Her words became sparse and chosen. Her eyes, once expressive and searching, now looked almost distant, focused inward on something Amelia couldn't see. She asked questions, gently at first. Kim would offer soft reassurances. "It's just reading," or "It's peaceful, Mom." And at a glance it made sense. A Bible study group led by older women, rooted in Scripture, hosted in a house not far from their own. What could be safer than that? But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not wrong in a dramatic, obvious way, but off in the way that makes your stomach tighten before your brain catches up. One night, after Kim had gone to bed, Amelia passed by her room and found the door cracked open. Kim was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, a candle burning in front of her. She was humming softly, a tune that didn't resemble any song Amelia had ever heard. Next to her lay an open notebook, filled with looping circles and Vertical markings, not words, not images, just shapes. Amelia didn't say anything. She stepped away, quiet as a breath, but something in her chest told her it was time to stop pretending everything was fine. The next morning, she pulled out the manila folder she had kept from their realtor, the one with blueprints of the neighborhood and historical zoning plans. She found the diagram for the house on Eldon Street, the one that hosted the gatherings. It had a basement, unfinished according to the plans, but strangely large in footprint. She studied the air vents and crawl spaces, mapping possibilities in her mind. There was a service grate outside, low to the ground and partially hidden by overgrown hedges. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. That evening, while Kim was in the shower, Amelia retrieved the compact security camera she had once used when caring for her elderly mother. It was small, motion-activated, and could be set to sync with her phone. She packed it in a bag along with gloves, a flashlight, and a thin screwdriver. Her heart pounded the whole time, not from fear, but from the weight of doing something. She knew her daughter would never forgive her if she was wrong. She went to the house on Eldon Street during the day, pretending to walk the dog. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of still that pressed against your skin. She approached the side of the house casually, crouching when she reached the hedges. The metal vent was old and rusted, partially open at one corner. She slipped the camera inside, adjusting the angle to point downward into the darkness below. The screen on her phone flickered to life, a blurry, angled view of concrete and shadows. She adjusted it until she could see the floor clearly. It would have to do. Then she left, heart thudding, hands trembling. The first 2 Saturdays. Nothing happened. The footage showed a dark, empty basement, quiet, lifeless, abandoned. She almost gave up, telling herself she was being paranoid. But on the 3rd Saturday, the feed flickered awake at 9:42 p.m. Motion. The screen filled with dim, hazy shapes as the basement lights came on. Figures entered slowly, one by one, dressed in muted robes or long skirts. They carried candles, books, and small bundles wrapped in cloth. Amelia leaned in closer, barely breathing. Then she saw Kim. Her daughter stepped into frame with the others, her movements slower, more measured than ever before. She didn't look at the camera, didn't seem aware of it. She took her place inside a wide circle etched faintly into the basement floor. The women arranged themselves around her, each one standing in silence, heads bowed. At the far end of the room stood an older woman in a white head covering, Sister Miriam. She stepped forward, holding what looked like an ancient book in one hand and a long, thin object, possibly a candle, possibly something else, in the other. The ceremony began with no sound, no voices, only movement. The women swayed slightly as if responding to a rhythm that Amelia couldn't hear. Sister Miriam opened the book and began to read, though her lips barely moved. A strange light seemed to flicker in the room, not from the bulbs, but something softer, like the glow of heated air. Kim stood motionless, her hands clasped in front of her, her face expressionless. Then Miriam approached her. She reached into her robe and pulled out a small vial, from which she dripped dark liquid onto Kim's forehead, then her chest, then her hands. The other women began to hum, low and tremulous, a sound that made the hairs on Amelia's arms stand upright. On the screen, Kim slowly closed her eyes and for a moment her lips moved. Not like prayer, more like repetition, as if reciting something she had memorized. Amelia's mind raced. This wasn't a Bible study. This was a ritual, something rehearsed, something secret. She took a screenshot of the frame, then another. She backed up the footage to cloud storage and downloaded a copy to her phone. Her fingers shook as she watched the rest unfold. A small bowl brought forward, a cloth unwrapped to reveal stones, a whispered benediction. When the women finally extinguished the candles and filed out of the basement, the camera returned to darkness. But something had changed. The stillness wasn't empty anymore. It pulsed with a residue, a charge, as if the room had absorbed what had occurred there and was now holding its breath for the next time. Amelia sat in silence, her phone still in her hand. She couldn't stop replaying the expression on Kim's face. Calm, devoted, lost. She knew now that something was happening behind those closed curtains, and that her daughter wasn't just a guest anymore. She was becoming part of something cloaked in faith but rooted in secrecy, something that didn't want to be seen. But Amelia had seen it, and she wasn't going to look away. The basement was colder this time. Kim felt it in her bones, before she even crossed the threshold. The air had changed, not just in temperature but in density, as though something had settled in since her last visit. The flickering lights overhead cast stark, pale reflections on the concrete floor, and the air carried a faint bitterness, like burnt herbs and metal. As she descended the creaking stairs behind Sister Miriam and the others, the world above her seemed to vanish. All that existed now was the room below and the silence they all carried with them. This wasn't like the earlier gatherings. There were no folding chairs, no reading circles, no soft scripture or whispered reflection. The basement had been rearranged. The bookshelves had been cleared, replaced by narrow tables covered in linen cloths. The faint circular etchings on the floor had been darkened, outlined with ash or oil, making the pattern visible even in the dim light. It resembled a wheel, spokes branching out from a center, curling in strange directions, more symbol than geometry. At the center stood a stool with a cushion draped in white. The women entered without speaking, each taking a designated place along the wall, forming an open ring around the center symbol. They moved like they had done this countless times before. Kim followed instinctively, joining the formation, her heart beating not from fear, but from a kind of strange anticipation. She had come to expect silence, to move within it, to breathe it like ritual. Her body no longer resisted it. She felt emptied, compliant, as if something had hollowed her out and made room for something new. Sister Miriam stood at the far end of the room, beneath a cross-shaped beam that hung like an axis over the space. She wore a longer robe tonight, its hem embroidered with unfamiliar characters. Her hands were bare and pale against the dark fabric, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and rhythmic. She didn't greet them. She didn't smile. She simply began. Her words were not English, not Latin. The sounds curled and bent, almost melodic, but with sharp turns that grated on the edge of comprehension. The cadence pulled at something ancient and nameless in Kim's chest. She couldn't understand the meaning, but it felt like it was meant for her, like it was already etched somewhere inside her. The others began to echo the words in unison. Their voices were quiet, reverent, almost humming. The ritual had begun. Miriam gestured to Kim. Without speaking, two of the older women guided her to the center of the symbol and helped her onto the cushion. Kim sat, legs folded beneath her, hands resting on her knees. Her breathing was slow, but her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She could feel the room closing in around her, not physically, but spiritually. The air was thick now, full of pressure. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt expectant. The chanting continued as Miriam stepped forward, carrying a shallow bowl filled with dark liquid. She dipped her fingers into it and pressed the substance in 3 places: Kim's forehead, her sternum, and each palm. The touch was light, but the liquid stung faintly, like citrus or alcohol on a fresh wound. It smelled of earth and iron. Then Miriam reached into her robe and drew out a folded piece of white cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small black stone, smooth and ovular, and a coil of fine red thread. The women began to sway gently, left to right, their feet unmoving but their torsos in motion, like seaweed beneath still water. Miriam tied, the thread around Kim's wrist knotting it 3 times. Then she pressed the stone into Kim's right hand and closed her fingers around it. Her lips moved, barely audible. Kim felt her chest tighten. She closed her eyes as if instructed by some inner voice. The sounds in the room deepened. The chant no longer came from outside her, but from within, vibrating through her ribs, through her jaw. She felt as though she were sinking, falling gently backward into something not entirely hers. Her body remained upright, still, calm, but her mind unraveled. Images flickered like after-images in her vision. A circle of women in firelight, pages with writing that shifted when read, a stairwell that descended into forever, a name she couldn't pronounce. Then, silence. Her eyes opened. The room was still. The chanting had stopped. Miriam stood before her, looking not triumphant, but solemn. The others remained in place, heads bowed, as if mourning or blessing. Kim looked down at her hand. The stone was warm now. Her wrist bore, the red thread, now dampened slightly by sweat. Miriam took the stone from her and returned it to the cloth. She placed both into a small wooden box and sealed it. Then she raised her hand, and the women slowly returned to standing still. One by one, they approached Kim, each placing a hand on her shoulder for a brief moment before returning to the wall. It was not affection. It was confirmation. Kim stood, her legs slightly unsteady. The cushion beneath her was warm. Her skin tingled. She felt changed, not entirely, but partially, as though she had stepped halfway through a door that could no longer be closed. Miriam spoke again, this time in English, but her words were few and quiet. Something about passage, about readiness, about silence. Kim only half heard them. Her mind was still humming. Her body moved on instinct, following the others as they extinguished candles and folded cloths. No one explained what had happened. No one needed to. When they ascended the stairs, the warmth of the upper floor felt strange, too bright, too soft. The house smelled of tea and lemon and fabric softener again. Normalcy wrapped itself around her like a thin disguise. The women returned to their roles as caretakers and neighbors, their smiles gentle, their movements slow. But beneath it all, the ritual still pulsed like a second heartbeat. Kim walked home with a sense of heaviness that wasn't sadness. She wasn't frightened, but she no longer felt entirely her own. The basement had taken something, and left something else in its place. Amelia hadn't slept in 2 nights. The images from the camera replayed over and over in her mind. Her daughter, kneeling on that cold floor, hands clasped, eyes closed, her face tilted upward, not in peace, but in submission. The low, throbbing chant still rang in her ears, even though she had muted the video long before the ritual ended. She had watched the footage a dozen times, hoping to see something she had missed, a sign that it was all a misunderstanding, a strange but harmless spiritual gathering taken out of context. But each viewing only deepened her unease. It was not scripture they were reciting, not faith they were offering. It was something older, stranger, hidden behind the language of sanctity. She knew she couldn't keep it to herself. Not anymore. She backed up the footage to a secured drive, exported still frames from the clearest parts, and reached out to the only person she trusted with something like this. David Harper, an investigative journalist she had known from years back. The kind of man who still believed in long-form stories and who wasn't afraid to chase whispers into darkness. She didn't give him details in the message, just a location, a time, and one screenshot. A woman in a nun's habit, standing over a blindfolded girl with a circle drawn beneath her. That was enough. He arrived the next day, notepad in hand, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She showed him everything. The camera setup, the footage, the downloaded files, the page from the building's blueprints. He said almost nothing until the video ended. Then he leaned back and asked only one question. Had she contacted the authorities? She hadn't. Not yet. Some part of her still clung to the fear that no one would believe her, or worse, that they would but do nothing. After all, no one was being hurt. Not visibly. There were no bruises, no chains, no blood. Just silence, structure, and an overwhelming sense of something deeply wrong. But Harper didn't hesitate. He sent the video to a private network of reporters, some with contacts in law enforcement, others in religious investigative circles. The footage began to circulate quietly, first through encrypted emails, then through closed journalist forums, until it landed in the inbox of someone who had the power to act. Within 48 hours, the authorities arrived at the house on Eldon Street. It was a gray afternoon when they came, 3 black SUVs and 2 marked police cars pulling up with quiet efficiency. No sirens, no spectacle, just quiet purpose. Amelia watched from her car parked across the street, hands gripping the steering wheel, her breath locked in her chest. Officers approached the house calmly. A woman answered the door. Not Sister, Miriam. Someone younger, someone who smiled warmly as if welcoming old friends. She spoke briefly with the lead officer and then stepped aside. The team entered. The door shut behind them. 15 minutes passed, then 20. When the door opened again, officers began to emerge with items in evidence bags. Books, cloth-wrapped bundles, a small wooden box. One carried out a candle holder caked in something dark and waxy. Another held what looked like a journal, thick and worn. One officer emerged from the side of the house with something heavier, metallic, long, wrapped in cloth like a sacred object. None of them looked triumphant. They looked confused, disturbed, but there were no arrests. No women in handcuffs, no shouting, just polite conversation, nods, paper exchanged, and then quiet departure. Later, the official report would say the house contained no illegal materials. The basement, though oddly arranged, had no signs of criminal activity. The women present described their meetings as spiritual, meditative, based on forgotten early traditions of Christian mysticism. Nothing actionable, nothing punishable. The story might have ended there, just another strange corner of suburban secrecy, if not for what came next. The video leaked. No one knew who released it. Harper swore it wasn't him. Amelia certainly hadn't. But somehow, a compressed version of the footage appeared on a fringe news blog, buried at first, then shared to a message board. It was picked up by an amateur true crime YouTube channel. Within days, it spread across the internet like wildfire. The headline read, "They thought it was just a Bible study group." But what the camera caught in the basement shocked everyone. Comment sections flooded with speculation. Some cried cult. Others called it performance art. Religious forums accused it of being blasphemous, while occult communities whispered that it looked eerily familiar. Dozens of users claimed to recognize the symbols on the floor, variants of esoteric seals, ancient rites hidden within Gnostic texts. Someone even traced Sister Miriam's face to an archived convent roster from a now-defunct order in Arizona, where she had once been listed under a different name. Authorities were forced to respond, issuing statements, conducting interviews, promising follow-up investigations. But by then, the women were gone. The house had been emptied, stripped of its books, its candles, even the cushions from the floor. The only thing left in the basement was a faint imprint on the concrete where the circle had once been, like a shadow that refused to fade. Amelia kept Kim close after that, trying to pretend life could return to normal. But something in her daughter had shifted. She still spoke softly, still obeyed gently, but there was a calmness that felt unnatural, a delay between question and answer, a hollowness behind the eyes. She no longer drew in her notebook. She no longer dreamed out loud. Sometimes, late at night, Amelia would hear her daughter whispering to herself in a language she couldn't understand. The ritual was over. The footage had been seen. The world had taken notice. But the circle never really closed. It simply moved, quietly, elsewhere. Weeks passed, and the noise around the footage began to fade. The comments slowed, the coverage cooled, and the headlines gave way to newer outrages, fresher scandals. In the way of all things viral, the story of the basement ritual slipped out of public attention, becoming just another strange video lost in the endless scroll. But for those who had seen it, truly seen it, something had changed. Something had settled into the quiet parts of their lives, like ash falling in an unseen layer across memory. For Amelia, life narrowed to the small perimeter of home and daughter. She watched Kim like someone might watch the weather, reading shifts in tone, trying to predict the storms. Kim was still polite, still composed, but it was no longer a teenager's silence. It was something deeper, something watchful. Her eyes no longer searched for connection but observed with eerie calm, as though life itself had been reduced to a study. She helped around the house. She attended school, but her presence felt delayed, like an echo of someone who had once lived fully in her body. At night, Kim sometimes rose from her bed without sound. Amelia would find her standing in the hallway, barefoot, facing the wall with her hands folded at her sides. She would gently guide her back to bed, and Kim would go willingly, lying down without protest, her eyes open until the sun began to rise. When asked, she would recall nothing, or she would smile faintly and say she'd just been dreaming. Amelia no longer showed her the footage. She had hidden it away, buried in drives and encrypted folders as if trying to keep it from bleeding further into their lives. But it was too late for that. The ritual had done something. Not just to Kim, but to the house, to the air, to the silence that filled the spaces between their words. There was a new gravity in their home, an invisible center pulling everything inward. One evening, as twilight gathered in the corners of the room, Amelia found a small folded note on the kitchen table. It was written in Kim's careful handwriting. The words were simple. "It's not over. They're still gathering." No explanation, no context, just that. And beneath it, a symbol. Not one from any language Amelia recognized, but one she had seen scorched into the basement floor in the grainy footage, the same circle with lines branching outward like reaching arms. The house on Eldon Street remained empty. For sale signs came and went. Neighbors stopped asking questions. Some claimed they had never really seen anyone enter or leave. Others spoke of shadows behind curtains, flickers of candlelight at odd hours. But nothing more came of it. The women had vanished, and no one could prove they had done anything wrong. There were no victims who would speak. No laws had been clearly broken, just the sense that something had come and gone, leaving behind only questions and the kind of silence that never felt clean. But then, in another town, a new gathering began. It started the same way, women arriving one by one. A house with heavy curtains, flyers that mentioned scripture and stillness. The same language, the same structure. A different name on the invite, a different face leading the prayers. But the same eyes, the same rhythm, the same circle. And somewhere in the crowd, a new girl arrived. Young, uncertain, looking for peace in a world that felt too loud, too fractured. She was welcomed in. She was offered tea. She was shown the place where the women sat in a wide, soft circle, Bibles open, candles burning. She listened. She nodded. She stayed. Back in her home, Kim stood at the window, watching the wind move the trees. She no longer waited for something to happen. She no longer feared what she had seen. The thread around her wrist remained now, faded to a soft pink hue. She touched it absent-mindedly, not as a memory, but as part of herself. A quiet connection to something larger than understanding, something vast, something watching. Amelia, in the other room, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the sound of her daughter's soft humming. The tune was the same as it had been that night in the basement, low and slow and hollow. She didn't interrupt. She didn't speak. She simply listened, heart thudding against her ribs like a warning bell she no longer knew how to silence. The circle had never broken. It had only widened.